The amphitheater hummed with anticipation as students filed in, their voices blending into a cacophony of languages. The Galactic University of Survival Sciences was known for its brutal, hands-on approach to teaching, and today's lesson promised to be no exception. At the center of the raised platform stood Professor HFY, his elongated, insectoid form wrapped in the ceremonial robes of his station. His multifaceted eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on the lone human among the group. "This will test more than your strength," HFY announced, his voice an unsettling blend of clicks and reverberations. "It will test ingenuity, resilience, and efficiency." He extended a clawed limb toward the holographic display behind him. A simulated landscape flickered into view, a rugged, alien terrain with towering fungi, jagged crystalline outcroppings, and swirling, violet-hued clouds that promised unpredictable weather. The challenge is simple. You will be dropped into this environment and tasked with constructing a shelter capable of withstanding the elements. You have 1 hour. A murmur rippled through the assembled students. Some exchanged confident glances, while others flexed their specialized appendages, already strategizing. The massive, stone-skinned Gorgoth beside Jack let out a rumbling chuckle, his voice like grinding boulders. "An hour? Plenty of time," he boasted, flexing a granite-like fist. Gorgoth build fortresses, not flimsy shelters. A sleek, silver-skinned Siltharian student flicked a delicate hand dismissively. "Please, you need time to lift your primitive rocks. We, on the other hand, shape matter with our minds. I could construct a flawless structure before your first stone is set." Her violet eyes shimmered with telekinetic energy. On the far side of the group, a reptilian Xeric student flicked his forked tongue. "Digging is the answer. Burrowing below the surface offers the greatest protection. Your foolish constructions will crumble, but the Earth? It endures." Professor HFY let them posture. It was part of the exercise, evaluating not just their skill, but their attitudes toward adversity. Finally, his gaze settled on Jack, the only human present. Unlike the others, Jack hadn't spoken. He stood with his arms crossed, listening, absorbing. HFY's antennae twitched in mild amusement. "Human," he said, the word carrying a note of skepticism. "You have yet to proclaim your species' supposed superiority. Have you no argument to make?" Jack shrugged. "I'll let my work speak for itself." The professor clicked his mandibles. "We shall see." He raised an arm, and the hologram flickered out. "Prepare yourselves." Moments later, the world around them changed. The simulation was flawless. The scent of damp foliage, the distant chirr of unseen creatures, the shifting sky where violet clouds churned with the promise of a storm. The students scattered, each moving according to their species' strengths. The Gorgoth lumbered toward a pile of massive rocks, hefting them into place with raw strength. The Siltharian closed her eyes, lifting branches and crystalline shards with her mind, weaving them into a floating lattice. The Xeric vanished into the earth, his clawed fingers tunneling at impressive speed. Jack exhaled, scanning the terrain. He spotted what he needed almost immediately, a fallen tree with sturdy, straight branches. Without hesitation, he moved. The others worked in bursts of exertion, grunts, muttered incantations, concentrated effort. Jack, by contrast, worked smoothly. His hands moved with practiced ease, selecting materials not based on their size or weight, but on their utility. He stripped vines, weaving them into bindings. He snapped smaller branches with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. The Gorgoth had managed to stack several massive stones into what resembled a crude wall, but as he added another boulder, the entire structure teetered. He cursed as it collapsed into a heap of rubble. The Siltharian's floating structure shimmered with elegance, but as she shaped another beam into place, her concentration wavered. The entire framework destabilized, twisting unnaturally before crumbling into an ungraceful heap. Underground, the Xeric encountered an unexpected problem. The soil was wetter than he anticipated, and his tunnel walls began to sag inward. He scrambled to reinforce them, but for every handful of dirt he packed, another section caved in. Meanwhile, Jack had already finished. His shelter, an A-frame structure built from interwoven branches and reinforced with tightly wound vines, stood firm against the wind. The slanted roof was layered with broad, waxy leaves, ensuring water runoff. A small trench in front of the entrance would redirect any unexpected flooding. It was simple, efficient. He leaned back against the trunk of a tree, took a sip from his canteen, and watched. The first to notice was the Siltharian. She wiped sweat from her brow, frustration plain on her face, only to glance Jack's way and freeze. Her expression soured. "Impossible," she muttered. The Gorgoth followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "No way," he rumbled. "How?" The Xeric emerged from his unstable burrow, blinking against the light. He took one look at Jack's shelter and hissed in disbelief. Finally, Professor XY Loth approached. He examined Jack's work with the same critical eye he'd given the others. He tugged at the vines, checked the joints, even simulated a gust of wind with a flick of his claw. The structure held firm. "This took you," XY Loth hesitated. 10 minutes? Jack nodded. The professor studied him for a long moment before stepping back. He turned to the rest of the class. "Continue," he instructed. "Let us see if anyone else can match the human's efficiency." Jack said nothing. He simply sat back and waited, while around him, the others scrambled to finish what he had already perfected. The storm broke sooner than expected. The violet clouds, once distant and swirling lazily above the alien landscape, thickened into a roiling mass. A sharp wind howled through the jagged terrain, rattling loose branches and sending sheets of dust spiraling into the air. The first drops of rain were not water, but viscous, gel-like droplets that clung to surfaces and made movement sluggish. Jack remained where he was, seated beneath the shelter he had constructed. He ran a hand over the smooth binding of his woven vines, satisfied with their strength. Around him, the others were still fighting to complete their structures, their frantic movements betraying their frustration. The Gorgoth, undeterred by his earlier failure, had started again with a new approach, stacking his boulders in a tighter formation, packing mud between them in an attempt to create stability. But the gel rain was turning the ground slick, and each stone settled unpredictably, shifting the entire foundation. The structure groaned under its own weight, and with a final, grinding crack, it collapsed once more. He let out a deep, guttural growl and slammed his fist into the mud. The Siltharian's floating lattice of interwoven materials shimmered with an unnatural grace, suspended by delicate threads of psychic energy. She was pouring every ounce of concentration into keeping it stable, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. When the first gust of wind struck, she flinched as if physically struck. The entire structure rippled, and in that instant of distraction, the bindings unraveled. One by one, the floating pieces dropped from the air and crumbled into the mud. She let out a choked sound of disbelief, her hands trembling. From beneath the soil, a frustrated hiss signaled the Xeric's struggle. His burrow had not accounted for the composition of the alien dirt, and now the moisture was causing the tunnels to collapse. He clawed his way upward, breaking the surface just as a fresh wave of rain coated him in sticky gel. His eyes darted toward Jack, toward the shelter that stood firm while the others failed. His pupils narrowed. Professor XY Loth had been silent, observing, analyzing. Now, with slow, deliberate steps, he approached Jack's shelter. The alien's many-jointed fingers traced the structure, testing the tension of the bindings, the angle of the supports. He pressed against the frame, assessing its resistance. When a particularly strong gust of wind rolled through, rattling loose debris across the landscape, Jack's shelter barely shuddered. The professor straightened, his mandibles clicking softly. "Explain," he demanded. Jack leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "What part?" "The speed, the efficiency, the simplicity." Jack glanced at the ruins of the other shelters. The alien students still stood among their failed constructions, their expressions ranging from anger to reluctant curiosity. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "You all relied on what you thought would work best," he said. "Brute strength, psychic control, instinctive burrowing. But survival isn't about the strongest force or the most advanced ability. It's about adaptability, efficiency. The Gorgoth crossed his massive arms. You mean luck? He muttered. Jack shook his head. I mean experience. He gestured to the structure behind him. On Earth, we don't have exoskeletal armor like you do. He nodded at the Gorgoth. We don't have natural telekinesis. His gaze flicked to the Siltharian. And we definitely don't have built-in burrowing instincts. He met the Xeric's narrow-eyed stare. We had to learn how to survive. We had to invent tools, test ideas, fail over and over until we figured out what worked. Professor XY tilted his head. But you did not fail here. Jack gave a small, knowing smile. Because humans already have failed. Thousands of times, across thousands of years. We learned from it. And we passed that knowledge down, refined it, tested it in every possible condition. He tapped a finger against the framework of his shelter. This is just one of 100 different ways we know how to build a shelter. I picked the fastest one. The wind howled again, carrying the scent of damp foliage and churned earth. The alien students exchanged glances. The Siltharian's hands curled into fists at her sides. But I could have done the same, she insisted. I should have been able to. Jack studied her for a moment before responding. You relied too much on control, he said. Telekinesis is useful, sure, but it's also delicate. Too many moving parts. The moment you lost focus, everything collapsed. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. Jack turned to the Gorgoth next. Strength is great, but you wasted too much time trying to build something that needed perfect balance. And in this environment, there's no way to guarantee that. You'd have been better off with a simpler design. The Gorgoth grunted, eyes narrowing. Then, finally, Jack addressed the Xeric. Burrowing works if you know the terrain. But you assumed the ground was stable. If you tested the soil first, you might have realized it was too loose. The reptilian alien's tongue flicked out, but he didn't argue. Professor XY folded his many arms behind his back, his posture unreadable. His gaze lingered on Jack's shelter for several long moments before he finally spoke again. You claim humans have no biological advantages, he mused. And yet, it seems you possess something none of these other species have. Jack shrugged. Maybe, but it's not biology. It's practice. For the first time, there was no immediate rebuttal. The other students, some still standing in the ruins of their failed shelters, watched him with something different in their expressions now. Not frustration, not skepticism, something else. Recognition. Professor XY's mandibles twitched. Fascinating. The wind howled, but Jack's shelter did not move. The others had an hour to complete their task, but now it no longer felt like a test of endurance. It felt like something else entirely. A lesson. And Jack had already passed. The rain tapered off, leaving behind a landscape slick with gelatinous residue. It clung to the remains of broken structures, pooling into crevices of toppled stones and seeping into the loose soil. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and alien flora, carried an uneasy silence. Jack remained where he was, seated under his shelter, his hands idly toying with a stray piece of vine. The other students stood among the ruins of their attempts, their expressions ranging from frustration to reluctant contemplation. None of them spoke, but their gazes drifted toward him, toward the structure that had endured while theirs had crumbled. Professor XY finally broke the silence. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as though weighing the significance of what he had just witnessed. His multi-jointed fingers traced the woven supports of Jack's shelter once more, but this time, there was no skepticism in his posture, only curiosity. This exercise, the professor said, his voice measured, was designed to test survival instincts, to see which species could most effectively construct a safe haven in an unpredictable environment. And yet, only one of you succeeded. He turned, his multifaceted eyes sweeping across the group. Why? The Gorgoth shifted, his massive frame tense with lingering irritation. His methods were unnatural, he muttered. He didn't rely on strength or endurance. He built fast with weak materials, yet it held. He looked at Jack then, his stone-like brow furrowed. I don't understand. Jack met his gaze evenly. Because survival isn't about brute force, he said. It's about knowing when to use force and when to use something else. Strength is great, but if you don't have a plan, it's just wasted energy. The Siltharian, arms crossed, exhaled sharply. You're saying we overcomplicated it? Jack nodded. Exactly. He gestured to her, then to the others. You all tried to use what your species excel at, lifting, digging, manipulating. But survival isn't about showing off strengths. It's about adapting to what's in front of you. It's about efficiency. The Xeric flicked his forked tongue, his yellow eyes narrowing. Then why did you succeed so quickly? Jack leaned back against the trunk of his shelter, considering the question. Because humans have had to adapt. We don't have claws for digging or psychic abilities for lifting. We don't have armor or enhanced strength. So we learned how to survive using what we do have: ingenuity, problem-solving, and thousands of years of trial and error. He gestured to the structure above him. This isn't some stroke of genius. This is knowledge passed down over generations, refined by people who had to figure out how to stay alive without natural advantages. Professor XY Loth studied him for a long moment before turning to the rest of the class. What he says is correct. His mandibles clicked in thought. Many species develop single traits that ensure survival in specific conditions. But what happens when those conditions change? When strength is not enough, when telekinesis fails, when the ground itself betrays you? He gestured toward the failed shelters. This was not merely a test of building skill. It was a test of adaptability. And today, the human proved to be the most adaptable. The Gorgoth rumbled in dissatisfaction, but said nothing. The Siltharian remained silent, her expression unreadable. The Xeric, arms folded, let out a low, grudging hum of consideration. Jack stood, brushing the dust from his uniform. The thing about humans, he added, is that we don't just survive. We learn. We watch what works, what doesn't, and we get better. We don't rely on instinct alone. We test, fail, and improve. He cast a glance toward the professor. And we don't stop. A long pause followed. Then, to Jack's mild surprise, the professor's mandibles twitched in what might have been the equivalent of a smile. Perhaps I underestimated your species, XY Loth admitted. Perhaps many do. The words carried weight, and the other students shifted uncomfortably, as though forced to reconsider something they had always believed to be true. The wind picked up again, stirring the damp air, rustling the canopy of alien foliage. Jack took one last look at his shelter before stepping away from it. This was just one test, the professor said, his voice carrying across the group. There will be others, more difficult, more demanding, and I suspect that the human's approach will not always be the best solution. Jack smirked. Maybe not. He glanced at the others. But if it isn't, I'll learn. The professor inclined his head. That I do not doubt. Without another word, he turned, signaling the end of the lesson. The simulation flickered, dissolving the alien terrain into shimmering fragments of light. The ruined shelters vanished. The sky, once turbulent, melted back into the smooth metal walls of the training facility. Jack stretched his shoulders as the other students filed out, some still deep in thought, others casting him lingering glances. He had walked into this challenge an anomaly, a curiosity in a class of beings who believed themselves superior. Now, they regarded him differently, as equals, maybe even as competition. He smiled to himself as he followed them out. This was only the beginning.